Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show brought to you by GoldSilverBitcoin.com. We are more than honored today to be sitting down with John Carvalho. John is the CEO of Synonym, and he is a Bitcoin expert as well. And Synonym is working on what he calls the atomic economy. So thank you so much, John, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So what got you into Bitcoin?
Well, I originally got into Bitcoin, honestly, because I had heard of the Silk Road, and I was trying to figure out, why people were saying that you could suddenly buy drugs online and get away with it. And so basically I started researching Bitcoin, and pretty much within, I don't know, a couple weeks, I was deep in the rabbit hole and totally into like the whole idea and trying to consume everything I could like a sponge all about it. And that was in 2012, late 2012 when I started, and I only dove deeper and deeper every year since till now, where I'm at the point where I'm a CEO at a Bitcoin company owned by Tether, which is a large, also a large company within the kind of crypto space doing stable coins. And what we're trying to do is just basically show a whole Bitcoin ecosystem. And so, yeah, I can go more into my history of Bitcoin if you like, but there's a lot there that I skipped.
What's like the most surprising, ironic, controversial, novel like experience you've had working in Bitcoin?
Oh, that's a hard question. I don't know. I would say that, just generally, it's been interesting to see how people's reactions have played out, how, like one example is like how academia and, just economists, people that are supposed to be experts in the kinds of things that would be interesting to do with Bitcoin have generally been pretty horrible at it and pretty horrible at predicting about it, pretty horrible about respecting it as an innovation. And so that's maybe been one interesting part. It was also very surprising about like how hard and fast it would go up in price at times. Like no matter how much I ever really believed in Bitcoin, which was pretty early on, I never could get myself to be disciplined enough to actually hold it long enough to like be there to like, seize, being able to be like bloody rich when it went up on these big pumps. Like I bought my first Bitcoin for about $10. And so like if I had just done nothing that first year and just held the Bitcoin I had then, I'd be in a much different place financially right now. But the truth of it is like, you see your small investment of $10 per Bitcoin go up to $200, and you think, oh shit, I'm gonna like pay off my car loan. You don't think I'm gonna hold it for 10 years.
So now you mentioned like the atomic economy as it relates to Bitcoin, building out the Bitcoin ecosystem. What does that mean? We hear so much on the Ethereum ecosystem about building out kind of a whole economy, and Bitcoin does seem to be uh, less far down the road. However, a lot of people mention that the reason why developing on Bitcoin is so slow is for security purposes, perhaps, and also is a feature, not a bug, is what essentially perhaps a Bitcoin engineer might argue. They might also argue that when we do build out a decentralized finance, either leveraging Bitcoin security or other in another way, it will be in a modular fashion due to the way that Bitcoin's code does not allow certain updates, or at least the governance model for those updates, which some argue it doesn't exist, and some argue that too is a feature and not a bug. So then we are building out a modular Bitcoin DeFi ecosystem, and the modularity might actually be a more sound development practice. So what is a whole ecosystem or an atomic economy on Bitcoin?
So the atomic economy concept is something more related specifically to our company and our approach for realizing, Bitcoin ideals and like kind of a lot of the predictions of how people think things will play out over the years with Bitcoin. But I want to pause on that and take a moment to like patently disagree with your statement that Ethereum has some sort of has any sort of like extra progress when it comes to an economy, at least when it comes to in cryptocurrency. Because I think where Ethereum has progressed mostly is in compromising narratives to be able to be compelling for inexperienced users. And so basically in every kind of Bitcoin kind of seasonal pump, or every few years there's a major wave, a bull wave, where the price kind of keeps going up for a while, and then it kind of retraces and calms down, and a new bottom is found, but the bottom keeps rising as well. And this creates after effects where people like to speculate with their gains, and this kind of compounds each cycle. And each cycle, the Ethereum and other altcoins, or as we affectionately call them, shitcoins, kind of always have different marketing narratives and promotions prepared for ways that they feel that they can demonstrate normal financial and normal like web use cases and just technology use cases, and they just combine them with Ethereum and make it seem like this is something that Ethereum is doing that Bitcoin can't. And really what it is that these extra coins, these extra tokens, like we had ICOs, and then we had DeFi, and then we had NFTs. Most of these things either don't scale, aren't actually decentralized, or aren't even legal. And so they kind of like shed each one each season. Nobody talks about ICOs anymore, right? And in 2 years, nobody's going to be talking about DeFi anymore, at least not the way that it was known while it was popular. And even now, it's becoming less popular, even in Ethereum and other altcoin ecosystems. And the same thing will also happen with NFTs. And this is more a prediction based off of experience than one based off of like, competition and me trying to like talk bad about the competition. It's that I've literally seen this happen, about 4 or 5 times now. Like I know how it goes. I've been through this before. And I also know a lot about how these things work. And the truth is that there's a lot that's very censorable about how DeFi works. There's a lot that is very much like a kind of spontaneous Ponzi scheme and how these things work. And the aspect of like calling them finance is kind of a misnomer, in my opinion. Like they just basically print tokens and print tokens and print tokens, and they seed it with some liquidity from VCs like Silicon Valley VCs. And they have this kind of carousel between these companies and Coinbase and exchanges like this, where they let a few people get rich through this pumped in liquidity, but then they kind of shear everybody else, and kind of, that's it. Everything drops 98% and everybody ends up with no money. And so they kind of use examples of the few people that get rich as kind of the carrot to entice people to kind of put their savings into this and eventually lose it, because there's no liquidity in these things. You'll tend to notice that Ethereum and other altcoins, and then their derivative kind of token projects, they tend to drop severely whenever Bitcoin drops. Whereas, it's like when Bitcoin sneezes, they all get a cold. So I would say that, as a segue to Synonym and the atomic economy concept, what we're trying to do is we're trying to show, and distill which aspects of, economy and which aspects of finance are actually like rational and relevant in a non-scammy, non-hyped up, non-inflated sort of world. And, when you take away the concept of things like inflation, which is part of the idea of what something Bitcoin is supposed to cure, you still have to figure out what's left over that is actually required in an economy. And so what Synonym is trying to do with this atomic economy concept is combine earlier concepts from Bitcoiners that are about hyper Bitcoinization, which is essentially just the idea that Bitcoin will act as a backing asset for most of the economy, as one money that is like sort of the best, most reliable money, and then things will kind of be built out from there. And the only way you can establish this is if you have really good decentralization, permissionlessness, and security. And so the censorship resistance, all of this stuff is very important. But the thing is, if Bitcoin does actually work, if we do actually get the circular economy, if we do actually get hyper Bitcoinization, then part of the prediction is that governments are no longer able to regulate the economy where they were in the past, that big tech has pretty much been obsoleted by decentralized kind of mechanisms and networks, and that big banks are also pretty much obsoleted because people are kind of managing their own finances or managing their own assets, holding them themselves. And so the thing is like, if that becomes true, if you don't have big tech, you don't have big banks, and you don't have big government, at least in the economic sense, then what replaces those within a digital economy? And so Synonym is trying to fill out the rest of that story and say, we're building out ecosystem and protocols of tools that show how you could use Bitcoin as a base asset and what other applications and servers and platforms would be required to actually have a totally alternative economy that is kind of remove those three big monopoly players. And so we have things like, for example, we have slash tags, where it's a protocol for using Bitcoin keys, not the blockchain, as an authentication system to do things like, self-sovereign identity and cross authentication. And this fixes a lot of things with like middleman attacks. And you can kind of build on this primitive to do things called webs of trust. And this is a way that you can have sort of subjective web networks that are interoperable. And I know I'm kind of rambling and going far ahead, but the idea is basically just to show how, one, what it would actually look like if we had a digital economy in the way that Bitcoiners predict and actually realize that, literally. And then two, show how you can do all of this without extra blockchains, how you don't actually need the narratives and the kind of, carrots and various weird systems and Ponzi-nomics that altcoins tend to offer. So you can basically show how many of the use cases that like you mentioned earlier, that say Ethereum would claim to do or other altcoins claim to do, could actually be done with Bitcoin. But a lot of those things don't even require Bitcoin at all. They just require primitives like using keys as identity, self-serving your own data, deciding who you trust and when to give data, etc.
So where does Bitcoin and cryptos, where does Bitcoin end and cryptos begin? So I was actually speaking to Don Durrett, and he put forth a definition that I had not really heard put forth so concretely before, in which he argued that Bitcoin is not a cryptocurrency, that Bitcoin is a Bitcoin, it's its own technology, and that crypto, as we know it, is everything else. So in other words, Bitcoin and altcoins. And I suppose when you look closer into the term altcoin, it literally means an alternative too. So everything else in the overarching blockchain in technology sphere essentially references itself in relation to Bitcoin. So then what to make of, and this is a question I asked on Twitter, is like, what is the Bitcoin maximalist view of some of these technologies that are not building on Bitcoin? They're pegged to Bitcoin, or they're using Bitcoin, leveraging Bitcoin security through merge mining, for instance, such as Stacks, and then RSK and RSK. So there's a bunch of projects using that, such as money on chain. On Stacks, there's even an NFT market blooming. And then finally, there's also a project, and probably many like this, like Komodo, which I believe is merge mining with Bitcoin to leverage its security. So like, what is the maximalist view of those technologies?
So I'll disclaim to say that I'm speaking for myself and not other people. While I would probably categorize myself as a maximalist, there is no firm definition other than, that you believe that Bitcoin is the only blockchain you care about, and then from there the details vary. So for me, I have very specific definitions about where you draw lines on these things. I would say that sure, part of the design of Bitcoin was inventing what some people would call blockchain technology. But the issue with referring to blockchains and altcoins is that part of the design is simply that you can't actually sustain more than one over the very long term. We don't know how long, because we can't predict the future. But generally speaking, because proof of work is part of the design, that proof of work ultimately results in a very specific type of game that you can look at from a game theoretical standpoint, where everybody pretty much has to end up mining on one blockchain, because the alternative blockchains would end up being easily attackable by the miners of the main blockchain. And so this kind of makes mining other altcoins unsustainable at some point. At some point, these chains will get to be valuable enough and easy enough to attack where people will be highly incentivized to do so. And it will be easier and easier for them to do so as Bitcoin hash rate increases beyond the hash rate of other chains. Even if they use alternative forms of proof of work, even if they go to proof of stake, there are still mechanisms for actually, grinding proof of stake that are sort of similar to proof of work behaviors. And so a lot of this has been talked about for a long time. Bitcoin's been around for about 13 years now, and people have been through all these arguments. So I draw the line with altcoins at simply that while they may mimic and resemble Bitcoin, what most of them do is they try to add overhead into their network to differentiate from Bitcoin. So they add complication. This means that they become even more centralized and centralize even quicker, and making their chains even harder to defend in the long term. What Bitcoin tries to do is it tries to remain, strict to its primitives of being able to enforce the rules and the rule set for what it takes to actually just update the transaction set and who owns what. And it tries to stick to that and let you build, lay things in layers or modularly, like you mentioned, on top of that, so the base layer can have integrity and security. But the other chains try to take those things and put them on the base layer, which ultimately makes things very hard to defend, makes things more buggy. You will regularly see how there's like losses in different ways on Ethereum, smart contracts, either with a faulty, written smart contract, or somebody like puts a kind of backdoor in there, or there's always sort of compromises where people are losing millions and millions of dollars within these kind of systems that they tag inside of their blockchains. And so really the only kind of alternative that a blockchain or altcoin can ultimately offer that Bitcoin can't is being an alternative to Bitcoin. Like that is the main use case of altcoins, is simply to give people the hope that they could sort of buy Bitcoin yesterday, that they can say, okay, I didn't get in as early as I would have liked to on Bitcoin, so I'm going to try to get in early and take a higher risk on some other coin. And ultimately, this is sort of what we call a fiat mindset. They're just trying to see if they can get rich in fiat terms in a shorter term than if they were patient and held Bitcoin. But in reality, a Bitcoin maximus would argue that if all the people in altcoins simply, converged on Bitcoin, that they would also, their purchasing power to go up proportionally and even better than it would in any sort of risk that an altcoin could offer. It's just that they just want to find a way to take a shortcut. Where I would draw the line in regards to things like you referred to with stacks and rootstock, these are, sometimes there's side chains, and we have different types of side chains. We have federated side chains, we have merge mined, et cetera. Where I draw the line is that what these things claim is that they're scaling Bitcoin. And scaling has a very specific definition. It means, the ability to kind of add resources into a system and be able to get some sort of proportional or even exponential way of, increasing capacity in the abstract, either more users, more transactions, more processing, more bandwidth, whatever it may be. You're sort of trying to figure out a way where if you add resources, you in return, you're able to increase capacity. And so in blockchain, that is mostly to do with users and transactions, or quantity of transactions per minute or hour or whatever. And so these side chains, though, they don't actually have a deterministic or atomic link to Bitcoin. They're actually technically separate networks. And so what they do ultimately in practice is they say, send us your Bitcoin, and in return, you will get some token that we will treat as if it were Bitcoin in this network. And that to me is not really any different than an altcoin. Just because they are anchoring some data into the Bitcoin blockchain, or trying to borrow some, basically they'll bribe miners with merge mining, or another example with the say liquid is they'll replace miners with a federated network, or federation of owners. And so it's basically these permissioned private network that you need to gain access in and out of whenever you want to enter or exit it. So this is a very trusted, very detached thing from Bitcoin. So it's technically just as competitive with Bitcoin as an altcoin is, in my opinion. This is not a popular opinion. I will disclaim this is not something everybody believes, but it's something that I haven't found that anyone able to refute yet. And this comes from a lot of research on my part and understanding how these things work together. So part of like we have design principles in our company. Part of them includes that we don't support blockchains and we don't support side chains in any way in any of our products, and we don't plan to, because we just basically see Bitcoin as something that is maximally redundant. It does not scale. And so putting a blockchain on top of a blockchain, even if it were true, is also unscalable. You're not fixing anything. You're just kind of moving things over. And so we prefer to look at technologies like the Lightning Network, which is an actual layer 2 on Bitcoin that allows you to basically take and make Bitcoin transactions mutually with a counterparty, where you keep them offline. You don't send them to the base chain. You just continue to make them and you keep a private ledger together. And then when you're ready to settle the final transaction, you send that to the blockchain. And so the Bitcoin blockchain. And so this allows you to basically do like a form of transaction compression. You can do many transactions before you only ultimately settle one final transaction when you're done doing business. And the Lightning Network combines these channels, these private channels, and allows you to kind of transfer value across the whole network for everybody else that also has channels. And so you can route your Bitcoin through the Lightning Network, and you're making Bitcoin transactions the whole time. So you maintain this atomicity, this determinism, to where you know that you can get in and out of this scaling network without permission.
I think your definition of what's Bitcoin, where does Bitcoin end, and say all coins begin is technologically accurate definition thereof. It has been interesting to see the way in which these separate networks have leveraged Bitcoin's brand in order to market themselves as being somehow a part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, if you will. When I think it's much more accurate to say that they are separate, even though they do leverage certain aspects of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I like to say every altcoin's job is creating a narrative against Bitcoin. Like, you will never hear them talk about how great they are without saying why that makes them better than Bitcoin. They're always living in Bitcoin's shadow, no matter how hard they try.
So now, what's the state of Lightning today? I think in 2021, we saw Lightning really sort of thrust into the spotlight within the Bitcoin community as a force to be reckoned with. I think Strike did a lot in order to shed light on Lightning and what it's capable of. And as we head into 2022, John, do you have a feel on what the state of Lightning is?
I mean, I would say the state of Lightning is that the Bitcoin community itself has done a great job kind of propagating information about it and adoption of it within its enthusiasts and experts and professionals. But there's still work to be done in kind of abstracting away the technology from the end user. And so the applications are still evolving a bit to make it something where, we're not beating new users over the head with like I mentioned to you, like, there's no reason that a user actually needs to know that channels exist, or that channels connect to other channels, or that there's a private ledger being held mutually that eventually gets settled. Like, all they want to know is that if I kind of pay an extra fee, I can convert my convert my Bitcoin into a form that I can spend it instantly and at low fees. And so we have to find ways to kind of make the interfaces that we present to people abstract these kind of technical issues away, and make the technology and how we implement it more robust and more reliable than it currently is, because there are it's a novel technology. Nobody's ever had to deal with this before, both from implementing it within platforms and implementing it within user interfaces. And so that's another thing that we're trying to do at Synonym. We are building a mobile wallet to kind of demonstrate how we think these things could be presented in a better way, and kind of presented to users in a way that doesn't intimidate them. And so I think that the next steps will probably be finding a way to bring Lightning to retail. And so, because I very much feel that that Lightning Network is actually a commercial technology. And so, for many, many years, way too early, Bitcoiners tried to do things like get their local pizza shop to accept Bitcoin. But nobody had Bitcoin back then. And so we've always been too early, both from a sense of adoption of the asset and in a sense of the technology, because people would say that Bitcoin is fast and free, nearly free to send. But based on how Bitcoin actually works, it's not actually true. Like ultimately, the cost of sending a transaction on chain on the base layer is going to get more and more expensive on average over time. And so we need scaling technologies like Lightning Network to keep that affordable for end users. And so I think now is a good time to begin trying to approach getting Lightning into point of sale systems, integrating Lightning with, user experiences like NFC and cards and things that consumers are used to, and getting merchants to accept this and add this to their commercial acceptance flow, so they can actually have Bitcoin be what they earn in and what they spend in, and start creating this actual circular economy.
As we move towards the circular economy based on Bitcoin, which I hesitate to call Bitcoin standard because that's kind of an moron to me based on Bitcoin's kind of initial market-based ideas and concepts. So like theoretically, we just want Bitcoin to have a shot out there in the marketplace. And if it proves to be the best option, it will be adopted. So that aside, we hear a lot about hyper Bitcoinization. What is hyper Bitcoinization and what is life like in a hyper Bitcoinized world?
So this is another term that some Bitcoiners might describe differently, depending on who you ask. But generally speaking, the spectrum ranges from, some people think hyper Bitcoinization means that Bitcoin will be the only money and that all other monies will be obsoleted, and that everybody will just be pricing everything in Bitcoin all the time. And that is like the extreme version of it. That's where I started when it comes to, being a maximalist and being a, Bitcoin only kind of guy. But as I've kind of learned more about how these things work and tried to actually model what would happen in an economy like that, I've kind of come to terms with that. I don't think Bitcoin will ever be the only form of money. You can use anything as money. Bitcoin. I don't even think that Bitcoin is purely money. I think that it is a great way to store a kind of score within the network, and then use that score as money. But you can anchor many things on top of Bitcoin. So another thing that we're doing at our company is we're actually going to bring the concept of tokens to the Lightning Network within our products using tech called Omnibolt. And this will allow you to have things like instant tokens that are denominated by the issuer. And so, for example, Tether is a very popular example, so I'll use it. But Tether basically issues tokens that represent dollars and euros and gold. And this is their three main products. And they basically hold these assets as a bank, and they provide like audits and information about their assets, to gain trust. And then they issue these tokens to the people in exchange for, their hard cash. And these tokens now can be used the same way that Bitcoin can, basically permissionlessly, borderlessly, all of this stuff. But now you have your volatility exposure is to the dollar or the euro or to gold instead. And so our vision for like how this plays out in hyper Bitcoinization is, I think that as a minimum form of finance, even after a hyper Bitcoinized situation where we say we've obsoleted the dollar or obsoleted major currencies and just nobody really cares about inflationary currency anymore, you're still going to need forms of credit, and you're still going to need basically the ability to issue credit on your reputation. And I think that Tether is kind of an early example of something like this. But I think it will evolve over time to include examples like, the equivalent of gift cards, like issuing gift tokens. And so a company could say issue, $50 of token credit, to your local butcher or to your, convenience store or Target or Walmart or Amazon or wherever. And these tokens are now bearer instruments that you can use permissionlessly, and they can also have an aftermarket. They're not only redeemable with the issuer, they're redeemable by anybody that will accept them. And so I also think that this could evolve to issuing tokens that represent the direct asset itself. In other words, they represent the product or the service. So for example, Starbucks could issue a token that represented a large coffee. And anytime you redeem this token, they will give you a large coffee, regardless of its price in dollars or euros or Bitcoin. And so this kind of changes that dynamic that's possible and allows these people to basically scale their business in ways that are like incompatible or don't require the regulation or violent enforcement of the government. And so instead they would use their reputation. They would say, okay, since we're a very trustworthy company, we're going to offer our coffee tokens at a 1% discount in order to get you to pre-purchase more of them so we can expand to open a second location. And this removes the need to have to like use inflation and to have to worry about interest and all of these things, because the interest is kind of backed out of the sale in the first place. And so now the customer takes the risk at buying products and services at a discount in order to give the businesses they actually use every day the capability to expand at a faster pace. And so you basically can still allow capitalism and trust within a world that is mostly backed by Bitcoin as the only useful money.
One of the obstacles I see to Bitcoin in the future is the current internet infrastructure, the ClearNet, the World Wide Web. So now there's lots of talk about how Bitcoin could thrive even without this internet, based on various sort of different, I guess, sort of arrangements or types of internet mesh nets come to mind. Can you speak to some of the challenges of moving forward, technically or technologically speaking, for Bitcoin? And there has been talk about creating internets based on blockchain technology. Could these solve any of the problems if you perceive there to be any problems?
So I don't think blockchains solve any web use cases. In other words, the Web3 narrative that's coming from the altcoin side of the industry or the crypto side of the industry is another round of the bullshit kind of, Ponzi-nomics kind of approach. They want to attach tokens to literally website use cases or decentralized web use cases that have been around for years and pretend that blockchains are somehow necessary or improving the situation. And really, they're just making it worse, because blockchains are very, very inefficient by design. They're meant to be maximally redundant. So you don't really want maximum redundancy in a situation where really what you want is like a relevance or a subjectivity aspect to your connection in your networks. It just doesn't scale properly. You have too many people holding too much data they don't actually care about. And so the web is certainly not going to benefit from blockchain technology directly. But as far as challenges for Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency and the internet, they're mostly related to censorship, and they're mostly problems for the users more than they are for Bitcoin specifically. In other words, for example, like it's going to be extremely difficult to ever like ban Bitcoin or blacklist it somehow across the internet tubes, unless you get like a vast coordinated effort from many governments. Like this is the only way you could do it. And if you were presented with that situation, or say even just one country was trying to get around that situation, it's a say Israel banned, Bitcoin. And now, so Israelis are now trying to figure out, how the hell am I going to like spend my Bitcoin and use my Bitcoin in a free way? They would need alternative internet access. They would need to be able to either access satellites or establish mesh networks, and things like this. You can broadcast Bitcoin anyway. You can broadcast it through radio waves, etc. Just not, you can broadcast it through writing it on paper, mailing it, but obviously these things become much less practical and convenient than having a free flowing, digital internet. And so I agree with you on that. Mesh nets are probably going to be something in the future that will not only evolve because of censorship, but because I just think as the world becomes a more diverse place digitally, you're going to want to be able to connect to people that on your terms, right? And so you're going to end up wanting to be parts of networks that might not be fully supported globally. And so I really believe that mesh nets are an important technology that should evolve over the next decade and become more prevalent. Right now, they're kind of more of a hobbyist thing, an enthusiast thing, but I do think you're right that these will be important to do things like evade censorship, evade, like you could have like weird things where like, their climate change goals, and so they're shutting off electricity, and so you don't have reliable access. Like who knows what ways they're going to try to disrupt you, and whether they're going to be intentional or unintentional. So you'll want ways to establish your own not only electricity but internet access and network access. And I do think mesh networks would be a cool way to handle it in addition to satellites.
And a lot of this has to do with decentralization itself, which is really interesting that Bitcoin has as one of its fundamentals that decentralization, because I really believe that decentralization can be applied to even just philosophies in the real world. So for instance, like we don't want centralized states, we want small states that are decentralized in order to make them maximally redundant, I suppose. And
Or maximally diverse.
diverse,
In
yeah.
the case of states, like people want to live where they like the rules. And if you don't like the rules, you want to be able to move somewhere that has rules that you do like. And so the more diverse states are and the smaller they are, the more competitive they will be as well. But the more centralization you have, the more efficiency you have. And so this is the tricky part. Centralization is not evil in and of itself. It's just easy to kind of exploit the people that depend on it.
There's so many parallels between the structure of the United States with the states' rights and that diversity, as well as sort of Bitcoin, as some Bitcoiners have argued, such as Patrick Byrne, that Bitcoin is a continuation of Western philosophies of classical liberalism, what's known today as libertarianism, and that diversity is certainly a part of that. I want to talk a little bit more. We've been talking, it's been a pretty technical talk, and I like that. I want to talk a little bit about slash tags, which is Synonym's new network protocol for establishing self-sovereign web experiences. You mentioned it earlier, that are enabling the next web in a parallel social economy. So what are slash tags and what can Bitcoiners expect from them?
So slash tags is basically a protocol and method for using key pairs instead of using normal accounts. And by normal accounts, I mean anything from, using your email address and a password to using your phone number or SMS or, any of these methods you might use to basically authenticate yourself inside of a network. Instead, what you can do is using the same method that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies use in general for proving ownership of your coins. You can just prove possession of a key without coins at all. And so you can use the same elliptic curve of cryptography that Bitcoin uses to basically, and this is what slash tags does, it basically uses the same curve in elliptic cryptography of Bitcoin to make keys that aren't used on the Bitcoin network at all. They're just used to be able to authenticate yourself. And the difference with slash tags and other authentication methods, like say PGP or what are some other ones? Ed 25519. There are various popular curves and things that people use for authentication. The difference here is we require also using and defining a schema that basically tells your counterparty how to form metadata about the key. And so you can have as many schemas as you want, and these schemas effectively act like individual, categorization, scoring, and access control systems. And so you can basically define, for example, anything from, the fields that would represent a movie, and this movie could be represented by a key and a file. And you could say, this is the name. There's a field for the name, a field for the year it was, released, etc. All the actors, whatever. And you could track mutually with other people, the metadata about keys. And you can make reputation systems with this as well. And so this is kind of how we envision replacing, big government within the economy by having basically a reputation system and having these reputation systems be locally defined by users. And so they're fully abstracted to whatever method you desire, and you can weight them however you want. And ultimately, these schemas act as a way of forming private interoperable networks. And so you can have as many kind of meta networks that interoperate and connect, and you decide who to add into yours, which data to feed into yours, and who to feed your data out to. And so you're kind of doing this local first method, unlike the current web where you're kind of choosing a central website and you're storing all your data there, like say Twitter, for example. In slash tags, when we create our decentralized social media platform, you will be creating all of your tweets locally and creating them locally and signing them with your slash tags key. And then people can subscribe to your feed directly from you. And if you get to be so large that you can't serve it yourself, you can now choose something like, say, a D Twitter or a decentralized Twitter to now they can subscribe to you and they can now host your tweets for you, and they can still prove they're from you because they're signed by your key. So you know that there's still integrity to your data even when it's being served by someone else. And this basically removes the walled garden aspect of websites and adds a sort of an interoperable format that turns these websites into mostly rendering engines instead of like these walled gardens. And so these websites will compete on their scalability and their pricing or whatever it may be, but they won't be competing by locking you in. Like if you get banned on, John's D Twitter, then you can just take your tweets and have somebody else host them or host them yourself. You don't get kind of trapped and deleted from reality, like kind of like how Trump did.
Moving on, you also list Omnibul as one of the technologies that you're building on. So it's a software project that you rely on to make your products. Omni is a platform for creating custom digital assets on Bitcoin. Omni transactions are Bitcoin transactions that enable next generation features, including Lightning Network compatibility via Omnibul. Can you speak to what is Omnibul and Omni?
So Omni is basically a way of you include a little bit of extra information in a Bitcoin transaction that only nodes in the Omni network understand or bother to understand. And this extra information is information about an additional asset on top of that Bitcoin transaction. For example, Tether USD, we could say, or USDT as it's called. And so if you have USDT inside of this Bitcoin transaction, you can now send the USDT to other peers the same way that you would send Bitcoin. And so Omni is just a way for anyone to be able to issue these tokens and define them, the quantity of them, how many there are, and pass these while passing Bitcoin transactions. And so it's kind of like this meta protocol on top of Bitcoin that allows the concept of tokens, or it's sort of like old concepts that we used to call colored coins. And so Omni Bolt is a way of now making a Lightning network out of these Bitcoin transactions. So if you take a Bitcoin transaction that is also an Omni transaction and also has tokens that were issued on Omni, like Tether, for example, you can now build a Lightning channel out of that transaction, out of those tokens and out of that Bitcoin, to be able to now pass Tether tokens over the Lightning network as well. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the idea here is that I believe that Lightning is commercial technology, and I talked about things like gift tokens and product and service tokens. Well, you want these things to be instant, and they don't exist on Bitcoin right now. You need to be able to issue them as a central trusted entity. And so Bitcoin allows you to, because it's such a raw abstraction and there is no actual specified info about it, you can now anchor things to it. And so Omni anchors metadata that lets you be able to understand tokens, and Omni Bolt anchors this metadata into the Lightning network as well, so you can use them the same way you would use Bitcoin and Lightning network.
Is that the same or different than Omni Layer, which is also listed on your website?
Omni layer is the base layer. It's Omni. So it's the full name of Omni, and then Omni Bolt is a separate. It's like how you have Bitcoin and the Lightning Network. You also now have you have Bitcoin and you have the Lightning Network on top of Bitcoin. Well, now you have Omni, which is on top of Bitcoin, and then Omni Bolt, which is on top of it as well. And so it's a parallel.
Thank you. And then another technology that you use is Hypercore. The Hypercore protocol makes it easy to build fast and scalable peer-to-peer applications, file systems, and databases using verifiable append-only logs in a BitTorrent-like distributed network. So where can you speak to Hypercore and Bitcoin? What is Hypercore, and can you speak to Hypercore and Bitcoin?
So technically, Hypercore has nothing to do with Bitcoin at all. What we're trying to do is we're trying to show, again, how if you combine the right technologies, you can create all of the ideal use cases to be able to have this atomic economy. And you can do so without adding extra blockchains or extra altcoins, et cetera. We're trying to basically, Bitcoiners for many years have said, you don't need a blockchain for that. You don't need altcoins for that, blah, blah, blah. But we've been pretty bad at saying what to do instead. And so what I'm trying to do with this, with Synonym and our product stack and technology stack and the atomic economy concept, is show that, to say, hey, you don't need altcoins. This is what you can do instead. Yes, if you want to go and gamble, then go to your altcoins and enjoy yourself. But if you actually are trying to solve use cases and problems, you don't need all that risk piled on. You can use this system instead. And so what Hypercore is sort of a modernized version of BitTorrent that uses, like you mentioned, append-only logs instead of just normal files. And these append-only logs are basically also locked by keys, much like slash tags. So what we're doing is we're using Hypercore in tandem with slash tags to be able to create these economic, abstracted network concepts and reputation concepts and publishing concepts and monetization of publishing to be able to use Bitcoin for all of these purposes. So we're pairing all these things together. They're not Hypercore is not a part of Bitcoin. Slash tags is not a part of Bitcoin. Slash tags is not a part of Hypercore. These are just technologies that you can use together to achieve these goals. And so slash tags and Hypercore are very complementary because Hypercore handles a lot of the kind of like BitTorrent swarming and file sharing and file storage aspects that are required for a decentralized economy. But with the slash tags, it allows you to now add metadata to kind of help define these things and find these things and permission access to these things. And so we're trying to basically combine these things to create an entire new economy and an entire new web to facilitate that economy.
What's the state of Bitcoin development today?
It's a very general question. I would say, I'm maybe what you would call a conservative when it comes to Bitcoin development. I prefer fewer changes, fewer feature additions. I'm not looking to like compete with Ethereum on features. I think that we can compete with Ethereum and other altcoin narratives on features on layers, or just not using blockchains at all. Like you don't need a blockchain for everything. So the state of Bitcoin technology, I think, is actually very healthy. Bitcoin development. We have hundreds of developers contributing. We have some of the like brightest experts in the world, cryptographers in the world that are focused on kind of maintaining and optimizing Bitcoin's code over the years. And we also have had some successful feature additions with things like the SegWit fork, and now the Taproot fork, adding kind of new ways to make data more efficient, make transactions more efficient, and extend a few new capabilities for Bitcoin that don't add overhead to the nodes in the network itself. And so I think things are pretty healthy. I would like to actually see the pace of changes, at least feature additions, slow down and change focus more to kind of cleaning up, any sort of baggage of the code base and refactoring that's required, et cetera, and focus more on optimization for a while, because we haven't fully realized the scaling that we've enabled with the past two soft forks yet. We still have more people to grow with adopting SegWit and adding that as an efficiency. We still have more growth to do with Lightning, which was enabled to be made practical by SegWit, and we haven't even begun to like take advantage of Taproot and its capabilities. So I think we could go for another 2 or 3 years easily without making many modifications to Bitcoin at all. And we already have plenty of developers, and we have like the best developers in the world maintaining this code. So I'm not really worried about like developers that are more interested in working on altcoins, because they're chasing money. They're not chasing, the design and the kind of purposes of blockchain and Bitcoin.
Is there anything more left to be said about the atomic economy concept?
I guess I'll just give like a kind of broad, simple explanation of it, which is simply the atomic economy concept is just combining the concept of hyper Bitcoinization and circular economy, ideas about Bitcoin, with the concepts of decentralized web technology and a self-sovereign internet. So if you combine these two things together, you can basically create a completely subjective and relative and highly efficient and fractal interoperable system that doesn't require, the participation of major monopolies, made like big tech, big government, at least big government regulation, and big banks. You really can choose to opt out of all those things within the atomic economy.
What's your hope for the future of humanity, and how does that relate to Bitcoin?
uh, wow. My hope for the future of humanity is that overall we embrace becoming more self-sufficient, independent, and responsible. I've said before about our technology and our vision that even if we make even if we're right, and even if we're so right that we actually make the most elegant design and ecosystem that the world has ever seen, it won't matter if people don't choose to use it. Like you have to actually use it. And it's our job as a business to try to find compelling ways to educate users, and use cases that are compelling for them to actually migrate over and use this instead. We have to demonstrate that the advantages, but there's still the requirement of like responsibility. Like, you have to be willing to hold your own keys. You hold your own keys for your Bitcoin, hold your own keys for your website accounts, host your own data as much as possible. Measure trust before taking actions. Only trust trustworthy people. You have to be a kind of mature, more evolved person to be able to like embrace all of this stuff. And right now, the direction of culture, at least in the West, is kind of going in the other direction. We're seeing a lot of, at least through the media, we can't actually tell the real quantity, but through the media and through the kind of loudest people, we see more of a movement towards socialism and dependency and sensitivity and not wanting responsibilities. And so that's obviously unsustainable from just a purely abstract economic sense. But my hope for the future is that we do go through a period, or sort of a renaissance, of people actually caring and wanting, to live their best life, and not wanting to kind of avoid everything.
And we see this movement being furthered through Bitcoin in so many ways. I'm not sure if you're at Bitcoin 21 in 2021. It was, however, a very uplifting experience, especially after at that point, I guess approximately, I guess it was 18, it was like 18 months of lockdown at that point, I suppose, or less. Actually, it was more like 15 months of lockdown. And to see 12,000 people gather and discuss ideas in the ways that they were was very inspiring. What else do people need to know about Synonym?
The first thing that comes to mind is that we're hiring. And so, it's a very competitive market right now in the Bitcoin world and crypto world for hiring developers and designers. And so those are roles that we're, pretty much always hiring for in one fashion or another. So, if you are a kind of production oriented person that wants to build on Bitcoin, keep an eye out for, if you don't see a role that's appropriate to you, keep an eye out for more roles. We'll eventually be adding business developers and other things as we release our products. And also, just to give it a chance. You know what I mean? Like, I know that it's an overwhelming vision and that we're trying to do a lot at once, that it's very ambitious. And I know that, like, for most people, they're never going to care as much as we do about the entire scope of what we're doing. And so we're trying to be very mindful of that. And, we're trying to like create separate brands for each of our products and allow somebody to kind of enter into our ecosystem from any door. And so if maybe all you care about is having the coolest like Bitcoin wallet that can do the most things, then we'll make sure our wallet is that wallet, and that wallet kind of provides you with a user experience that ushers you into the rest of the ecosystem. If you're interested in monetizing and publishing your content in a more, a less censorable way, and using Bitcoin to do so, then you can come in through our publishing platform when that's released. And we're basically doing this from every angle you could want in the digital sense, in order to be able to compete with big tech and these other monopolies. And so I would say, when it comes to Synonym, just understand that our goal is proving the Bitcoin thesis, and disproving the altcoin thesis, and disproving the kind of fiat Fed regime thesis as well. And so if those are things that interest you, then I would say pay attention to us. Give us your support in any way we can. Try to listen to our content and read our content, if you want to learn more, and just contact us and join some of our channels if you want to interact with us.
We've had the honor and privilege of sitting down today with John Carvalho. He is the CEO of Synonym. Thank you so much, John, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you everyone for listening.